Okay, hi everybody. It's Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and we are in the middle of Section 3, Chapter 32. I apologize for those who are an hour after us. We just changed the clocks here in North America, and they haven't changed the clocks yet in Israel. So there may be some people who are expecting the shir to start an hour hence. And so I apologize, but you can watch the recording afterwards. So what we're studying is a very, very important chapter for the Rambam in the formation of his theology, especially as it revolves around Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the reason for the commandments. We've really done most of the chapter already, but we do have some very important things to still discuss in order to do this chapter justice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen to give you the handout for today. As I mention every time almost, you're always able to access these handouts that we post on the screen by going to either the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim or by going to webyeshiva.org, which is the host of this Shiur, and looking at the course description, which has this handout as well downloadable. Now, up until now in this chapter, the Rambam has told us something that he has developed over the last several chapters, going back at least 5 or 6 chapters, that God's objective was to make us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation through the perfection of our intellects, by which man would obtain a proper knowledge of God. This is the Rambam speaking as the Aristotelian, who believes that the acquisition of knowledge, particularly a knowledge of God, is what brings man to absolute perfection, going all the way back to the very first chapter of the guide, which talks about the unique disposition of man, who is uniquely human based upon his intellect. So, if God gave us a Torah, it must be because the Torah is going to help you and me develop our intellects to the best abilities, to the best level that we possibly can. God also wants us to worship him exclusively because the worship of the divine will help direct our intellects towards that intellectual perfection. In order to accomplish this goal, God observed that the prevailing mode of worship at the time that the Torah was being given was through the offering of animal sacrifices to various deities, as well as burning incense before them. It would have been too difficult for the Jewish people to make a stark transition from religious worship through sacrifices to the abolition of sacrifices. This would be considered going from one extreme to another without any intermediary step. By analogy, this would be as if a prophet came to us today and commanded us that from now on we may no longer pray to God, fast, or call out to him. It would be very difficult for us to make that kind of adjustment. Instead, we may only worship through thinking. So if we were to be faced with that kind of challenge, it would be virtually impossible to expect people to assemble for thought worship without at least trying to say a few words. God therefore allowed for the continued practice of animal sacrifice, but transferred the object of that worship from false deities to the true God. So let's be very, very clear. I was just reading the synopsis that we present to you at the outset of today's shir. The sacrifices are really have an ulterior objective, which is to pull man away from false religious modes of worship, so that man can eventually readjust his sights and start perfecting his intellect. In other words, animal sacrifices are not an end unto themselves, because by bringing a sacrifice, that contributes nothing towards the perfection of my intellect. Instead, it helps pull me away from an erroneous way of worshiping God and allows me to redirect my focus so that I can work on eventually the perfection of my intellect. And the Rambam, the last part that we saw in this chapter, was where he asks the basic question. You're telling me that this step is necessary to bring man from one extreme, which is an extreme of where he identifies religion with animal sacrifices, to the other extreme where he's supposed to be working on perfecting his intellect. And so you need this intermediary step in order to get the Jew to that ultimate objective through telling him to bring animal sacrifices to God, not an end unto itself. And it's no different from when God took us out of Egypt. He had to direct us through by a circuitous route because we were not yet ready to face the Philistine enemies. We needed to develop courage, etc., etc. Now, even though God could have tampered with man's free will, in order to allow him to transition starkly from one extreme to another, we see through the Torah's system that human nature and free will is the one thing that God will not tamper with, even when performing miracles. And essentially, this really goes to the core of the human condition and why God gave us a Torah. God gave a Torah to the human being who is imperfect, who does not have the ability to have the strength and the conviction and the inspiration and the fortitude to always do the mitzvot for the right reason. And that's why God had to give us incentives of reward and disincentives of punishment, because he knows that we are not up to the level where we can just do things properly and reject all evil at the snap of a finger. The Torah is designed for the imperfect human, and as a result, we have animal sacrifices. Now, therefore, let us continue with where we are in the chapter. If you'd like to be able to follow along in the text, we are starting in the middle of page 529 in the Shlomo Pines edition. Now, he says the contrast between Korbanot, which is the second intention, that's what the term that the Rambam uses to say that this mitzvah is for an ulterior motive, not for its own sake. He's going to now to create a contrast between two types of worship. One, animal sacrifices, which is not really for its innate objective, versus another form of worship, which is innately valuable to God because it helps man achieve that goal of the perfection of his intellect. And that other mode of worship is what we call prayer, tefillah, tchina, supplications, which is consistent with the first intention, that is to perfect man's intellect. We note that the former is bounded and restricted by God when the commandments are given, not so for the latter. So if we wanted to create this contrast and notice how God treats these two types of mitzvot, God says for the korbanot, for the sacrifices, that they are bounded, they are restricted to a certain place and to certain people who may handle the korbanot. But when it comes to prayer, prayer is completely unrestricted and is always accessible to man. Sacrifices, even when done in God's name, was restricted by God in a way that it hadn't been before the Torah was given. No longer, after the Torah was given, could sacrifices be offered at any place or time as was the case before the Torah was given. Instead, God established one place and one edifice for the sacrifices. As the Torah says, El Hakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, there's going to be one place where God says you can offer the korbanot. Only certain kinds of Jews, namely the Kohanim, could actually bring the sacrifices on the altar. And so you see that there are limitations. And certainly, by extension, there's limitation in time. In other words, from the Rambam's point of view, you could suggest that the reason why we no longer have a temple is because human beings no longer have the need to offer korbanot as the intermediary transition phase from ancient modes of worship to the perfection of the intellect. He doesn't say that, but let's suggest that that could be included in this discussion as well. These all indicate that God sought to restrict the bringing of korbanot so that its practice would remain limited. By contrast, prayer is completely unrestricted by place and person, and the same holds true with many other mitzvot in the Torah, such as tzitzit, mezuzah, and tefillin, which the Rambam hasn't yet explained the reasons for, but as we see that he's alluding to at this point, those types of mitzvot, wearing the fringes, placing a mezuzah on your doorpost, and wearing phylacteries, wearing tefillin, are mitzvot that are inherently valuable to that project of perfecting man's intellect, as we'll discover. Now, next point. Because sacrifices are not a means unto themselves, we find that the prophets in Tanakh often castigate the people for focusing excessively on korbanot, since they are not God's real objective. And therefore, we're going to actually read this in our Haftorah for Parshat Zachor in a little bit over a week, where in the book of Samuel, King Saul is commanded to eradicate the enemy nation of Amalek. And it turns out that King Saul spares King Agag and spares the animals. And Saul says, the reason why I spared the animals, despite your commandment to wipe out every living creature, is because I thought that we could use these animals as sacrificial modes of worship after we successfully waged our battle with Amalek. And so, what is Shemuel's response? He says, "Hachefetz lashem ba'olotu zvachim ki shmoa b'kol Hashem." Do you think God wants burnt offerings and meat offerings as much as He wants you to listen to the voice of God? Hine shemoa mizevach tov lahakshiv mechelev elim. It is better to heed the word of God than to offer a good sacrifice. It is better to obey than to bring fatted animals, fatted rams as sacrifices. So you see that the prophet is basically belittling the practice of animal sacrifice because it is only a good if it is placed in the context of all of the other mitzvot that you do, because it is a means of pulling you away from idolatry, but not a way in and of itself of bringing you closer to God. Isaiah said in chapter 1, Lama li rov zivchechem yomar Hashem. Why do I need all of your offerings, says God? Savati olot elim v'chelev miriim. I am sated already by the abundance of animal sacrifices that are fatted that you have already brought. V'dam parim uchvasim va'atudim lo chafatzti. I no longer desire the blood of all of these animal sacrifices. And then he gets to the verse in Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah it says, Ko amar Hashem tzivakot Elokei Yisrael, olotechem sefu al zivchechem v'ichlu vasar. God says, you know something, if you're going to bring sacrifices, says God, you might as well bring sacrifices whose meat at least you can consume, in contrast to bringing burnt offerings which are completely consumed by the altar and which you have no benefit at least of the meat. Why? Ki lo dibarti et avotechem, v'lo tzivitim biyom hotzii otam me'eretz Mitzrayim al divrei olav hazavach, because I didn't speak to your ancestors, nor did I command them when I took them out of Egypt to bring sacrifices. And therefore, what the prophet is essentially saying is, I would much prefer, you might as well get some benefit. You're not benefiting by bringing these offerings to me. So if you're going to bring animals to the temple, you might as well eat them and get some aspect of benefit from them. Now, that's a pretty dramatic statement. It's a jarring statement that the prophet Jeremiah makes. Ki lo dibarti et avotechem. I never commanded, I never spoke to your ancestors when I took them out of Egypt about bringing sacrifices. Does that really make sense? I mean, isn't a very large portion of the Torah filled with the laws of the sacrifices in the book of Exodus, especially in the book of Leviticus? So the statement of Jeremiah that I did not command your forefathers upon their exodus from Egypt regarding sacrifices seems patently false. How is this to be understood? So the Rambam here gives us two explanations. He says, first, my true objective, says God, excuse me, is to bring you closer to me through a knowledge of God, that you listen to my voice. And that's really what, if you take a look in verse 23 of that chapter, it says, Ki imet hadavar hazeh tziviti otam lemor shim'u v'koli. I didn't command sacrifices. I rather command you to listen to my voice so that I can be for you as a God and you can be for me as a nation. And that you can walk in the path that I command you. The sacrifices do not accomplish this objective, says the Rambam, but rather only succeed in pulling you away from idolatry so that you'll eventually be able to accomplish the true objective of conjoining with God intellectually. But when you make the bringing of sacrifices your main form of worship and ignore the main objective of knowing and worshiping God, then there's no longer any inherent purpose to the bringing of Korbanot. This is why in the very same chapter, chapter 7 of Jeremiah, the prophet says, Haganov rotzoach v'naf v'hishavea lasheker v'kater laboal. He says, you think you can get away with murder and stealing and adultery and swearing falsely and offering sacrifices to the Baal idolatry, v'haloch acharei Elohim acharim asher lo yadatam, and to follow gods that were never taught to you. Uvatem va'amaratem lefanai b'bayit hazeh asher nikra shemi alav va'amartem nitzalnu. And then in the same breath, after you've committed all of these heinous crimes, then come to my house, my temple, and say, we have been saved because we are worshiping God properly, so that you can justify doing all of these abominable acts. Thus, the statement, I did not command your forefathers, really means that I did not give them this commandment as the main, as a true objective unto itself, but rather for the ulterior motive. So basically, what the prophet Jeremiah is essentially saying is, I never wanted the sacrifices to be your primary focus in worship. I just wanted it to be something that you would do to pull you away from idolatry so that you could get to the real purpose of the Torah, which is to intellectually perfect yourselves. So that's the first interpretation of the verse, which says, Ki lo dibarti et avotechem, I never spoke to your ancestors, nor did I ever command them when I took them out of Egypt to bring sacrifices. Second answer that the Rambam gives is provides a historical answer. When Jeremiah says that when the Jews left Egypt, they were not commanded about sacrifices, it can be understood quite literally. He was not referring to the Paschal sacrifice, which was commanded to them and which they brought while they were still in Egypt before they left Egypt. And the Rambam says, I'm not going to get into why God told us to bring a Paschal sacrifice. I'll get to that when we get to chapter 46 in several weeks from now. But rather, Jeremiah is referring to the very first mitzvot that were given to Israel right after we left Egypt, even before we came to Mount Sinai, at a place called Moreh, which is described in Exodus chapter 15, Parshat Bishalach. Right after we crossed the Red Sea miraculously, the Torah says, Vayilonu ha'am al Moshe lemor manishteh, that the nation complained to Moshe and said, what are we going to drink? Vayitzak el Hashem. So we know the story that Moshe cried out to God in prayer. God instructed him to take a piece of bitter wood, throw it into the bitter water, and it became sweet. And the verse ends by saying, Sham samlo choku mishpat v'sham nisahu. It was there that God placed a statute and a law for the Jewish people, and it was there that he tested the Jewish nation. Vayomer, and then God concludes by saying, if you hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God, and you do that which is upright, and you listen to his commandments, and you observe all of his statutes, then any kind of illness that I have placed upon Egypt, I will never place upon you, because I am the Lord who heals you. Now, what we want to focus on for the purposes of our discussion today, says the Rambam, is those words, Sham Sam Lo Choku Mishpat, that God placed before the Jewish people when they came to Moreh, Chok u'mishpat, a statute and a law. When we look at the Talmud, we discover that this refers to very specific commandments that the Jewish people were given even before they came to Mount Sinai. They were sort of given sort of a vorspeise, an appetizer of the mitzvot, a sampling of a small percentage of the commandments that would sustain them over the following several weeks before they got to Mount Sinai. According to the Talmud, it says that Eser mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'Mara. The Jews were given 10 commandments in Moreh. Sheva shekiblu aleim b'nei Noach. They were given the 7 Noachide laws, and added to them were dinin, v'shabat, v'kibud avaim. And then added to that were the civil laws, in other words, the laws about how to properly govern and structure a society, such as the laws prohibiting theft, the laws of damages and torts and so forth, the law of keeping Shabbos, and the law of honoring one's parents. Now, we're not going to get into how the Talmud knows that. It's a Talmudic passage in both Tractate Shabbat and Tractate Sanhedrin, but these laws, the Rambam focuses specifically on the civil laws and the observance of the Sabbath as what he wants to really bring out as to what Jeremiah means. Jeremiah says, when your ancestors initially left Egypt, They didn't get any sacrificial commandments. They got specifically the commandment to structure society properly and the commandment to observe the Sabbath. For some reason, the Rambam ignores the commandment of honoring one's parents, although we will get to that later on in our discussion of all of the Ta'amei HaMitzvot, all of the reasons of the mitzvot. But these two laws, Sabbath and the civil laws, help to fulfill the prime objective of both of these mitzvot, perfecting man's knowledge of God, since Sabbath observance ensconces within man the belief that God created the universe. We talked about this in section 2, chapter 31, and I would refer you back to the discussion there, where the Rambam really has an extensive discussion about why God gave us the mitzvah of Shabbat. And in it, he says that through the observance of Shabbat, man conditions his thinking to a God who is the creator and not an eternal universe like Aristotle believed. And the second thing, the civil laws, observance of the civil laws helps to perfect man's morals within a civil society, enabling him to, after that, perfect his intellect. If you recall, in chapters 27 and 28 that we learned just a few weeks ago, the Rambam had said that the only way that man can perfect his intellect is by perfecting his body. He does so by structuring a society that will enable man to live freely without harm and without harassment from other elements in his society. And that's why God gave us the Mishpatim. Now, the reason why Korbanot were not offered when we left Egypt was because they were not deemed to be of primary concern for God's objective. And so during those preliminary days before we got to Mount Sinai, God said, I'm totally fine with you not offering Korbanot because that's not the primary objective of you perfecting your intellects and conjoining with God. I'll put aside Korbanot, I'll suspend those because they're not really the main thing. And that is another proof to the Rambam's thesis that sacrifices unto themselves do not have innate value for God's project. The principle of Jeremiah, says the Rambam, is repeated in the Psalms. At the time of its writing, the whole nation was ignoring the primary objective and focusing instead exclusively on Korbanot. And thus King David states in Psalm 50, verses 7 through 9, Shema amim va'adabera, Yisrael ve'aidabach Elokim Elokecha Anochi. First, the psalmist says, listen up so that you will hear what I have to say and bear testimony before you. Lo al zivachecha ochichecha ve'olotecha lenegdi tamid. It is not, I am not demanding that you offer sacrifices. That's not the reason why I am calling you to task, because that's not something that you are failing on. Lo ekach mi beit chapar mimichla otecha atudim. I have no desire anymore to take any animals from your reserves, from your storage places, from your barns. I already have enough sacrifices, says God. That's not my concern. And the Rambam concludes the chapter saying, whenever this notion is repeated in Scripture, that God is unhappy with our sacrifices, the import is the same. Understand this thoroughly and reflect upon it. That's the conclusion of the chapter. But I want to remind you that when we finished our last class, when we got through the first part of chapter 32, we had presented to you the opinion of the Ramban, who really lambasts the Rambam for harboring such an opinion that the Korbanot have no inherent value unto themselves, but are really just a means to a greater end. This is very problematic, as we quoted the Ramban in our last discussion, we would refer you back to the handout that we gave last time, where we included the entire text of the Ramban's Nachmanides commentary to the Torah in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9. And when we try to reconcile the Rambam, we have to really go through the Ramban a little bit more carefully and remember what his challenges to the Rambam were. The Ramban began by quoting not the Rambam in our chapter, but rather the Rambam in several chapters hence, chapter 46, where the Rambam goes into a discussion of explaining why specific animals, particularly the cow, the sheep, and the goat, were chosen as the types of animals that God wishes to be brought as korbanot, to the exclusion of all other animals. And the Rambam there explains that this was to deflect the erroneous beliefs that of other nations that these animals themselves were deities. The other nations like Hindus in India deify the cow. And so, therefore, in order to remove that erroneous belief, God said, take the cow, slaughter it, and offer it to God. And therefore, you show that there is no deity within the cow, but rather it is a means to serve the one true God. Now, the Ramban had disagreed strongly with the Rambam, and he had said, and this is really just the one line that we'll quote from the Ramban, Vihinehem divrei havai. These are words of folly or words of vain words. Yirapu sheber gadol v'kushi rabba al nekala. They try to heal a great break in a person's body when by using, let's say, just a band-aid when you have a gaping wound. Ya'asu shulchan Hashem megoal she'einenu rak lahotzi miliban shel risha'im v'tipshei olam. And the Rambam is essentially suggesting, he's making a mockery of God's altar and basically saying that it's only, the sacrifices are only for the purpose of removing erroneous beliefs from the other nations. How then can Scripture say that the sacrifices are inherently pleasing to God and provide a savory fragrance to God? Furthermore, Nachmanides argues from both the stories of Noach and Cain and Abel. Now you see that therefore, even before the Torah was given in ancient times predating the Torah, even before there was any human being alive, Noah brought the sacrifice after he came off the ark. There were no other human beings that would make it feel that Noah would find it necessary to pull himself away from other people's idolatrous practices. Similarly, in the times of Cain and Abel, no one was worshiping idolatry. There was no idolatry that predated Cain and Abel, and that's certainly problematic. In both those cases, there were no deified animals, and therefore the Rambam's historical argument simply doesn't hold. Furthermore, when Bilam offered his animal sacrifices in an attempt to appease God so that he could curse the Jewish people, as is recorded in the book of Numbers, his intention certainly wasn't to divert false beliefs about animal sacrifices. So how will the Rambam explain these cases? And rather, the Ramban says, unlike the Rambam, there is intrinsic value to the offering of animal sacrifices. And what is that intrinsic value? Is that man is only affected and impacted when he is forced to utilize all of his faculties and redirect them towards a particular thing. And what are all of man's faculties? You have to utilize man's thought, his speech, and his action. Machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh. And the Korbanot accomplish that very goal because the Torah requires the bringer of a sacrifice to press down physically. That's the action, to make a physical association between himself and the animal. Focusing one's confessional on the animal, right, and using words when he brings a sin offering, to express a confessional while the animal is being placed on the altar, and then watching the animal and its entrails all burning and the smoke ascending up to heaven. And that causes man to think about the fact that ought to be me. That animal is my surrogate, and I am offering myself up to the Lord as a way of atoning for my sin. All of this will allow man to view the animal as his surrogate and will help him atone for sin. Ad kan the Ramban. This is the Ramban's explanation of Korbanot. It's a cursory explanation, and as many of the commentaries say, the Ramban himself realizes that there's much greater depth, profundity, and mysticism inherent within the commandments of Korbanot, but this suffices for him at least to show how much he disagrees, how strongly and vehemently he disagrees with the Rambam's contention that the Korbanot do not have any intrinsic value unto themselves. Now, I do want to provide you, before we leave today, with a rebuttal by the Ritva, Rabbi Yom Tov ben Avraham of Seville, who lives in the 13th century. He wrote a book called Sefer HaZikaron, in which he took many of the commentaries of the Ramban, those places where the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam, and he defends the position of the Rambam as best as he can. There are times when he basically says, I got nothing. But in the vast majority of cases, the Ritva views it. By the way, if those of you, any of you who study Talmud, know that the Ritva is a great Talmudic commentator, but he's also a philosopher. He also wants to help us understand the Moreh Nevukhim properly. And therefore, in his commentary to Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9, he takes up the quote from the Ramban and makes every attempt to respond to the Ramban's argument. Firstly, when the Rambam reveals Ta'amei HaMitzvot, he says he is not revealing everything. This is a general rule that applies to all mitzvot, not just Korbanot. So the first really, I think, very important principle, and this principle will not help just to understand the Rambam in chapter 32, but when we go through all of the ensuing chapters, it'll be important for us to understand, says the Ritva, that when the Rambam gives you a reason for the mitzvot, that's not the sole reason, but rather, as let's just read some of his words, he says, V'da'ati b'rav ha-moreh zal, b'ta'am zeh u'v'ta'amim rabim acherim shekatav b'mitzvot. I believe that when the Rambam tells you this is the reason for the sacrifices, not valuable unto itself, but rather just to pull us away from idolatry, and many other reasons for mitzvot that the Rambam will provide in the ensuing chapters, ki lo me asher ya'aminhu shehu ikar tam ha-mitzvah hahi. The Rambam does not seriously believe that that is the exclusive reason for that mitzvah. Ela sheratza latet kitzat ta'am bahem, but rather the Rambam wanted to give some aspect of reasoning or rationality to this mitzvah, ad sha'afilu hehamon shabo yeda lahashiv bahem gam la'apikores b'devarim sichliyim kitzat. The Rambam simply wants to provide a rational reason that will appeal to the apikores, to the heretic who is the philosopher. In other words, according to the Ritva, the Rambam, even when writing the Moreh Nevukhim, is clearly aware that there are deeper reasons for the mitzvot than the ones that he presents in the guide. However, the objective of writing the guide is to provide a response to those of the philosophical community who would argue that the mitzvot that are contained in the Torah are irrational and that there's no reason to fulfill them. And so to those people, the Rambam says, even according to your own Weltanschauung and your own worldview and your own way of looking at reality, I can show you how these mitzvot have a rational explanation that will provide purpose and meaning to your life as much as they do to my life. And then the Rambam quotes, the Ritva quotes that which the Rambam had written at the introduction to section 3 of the guide. And I'm just using the Friedlander translation. He says, what did the Rambam write? You are well aware how our sages blamed those who reveal these mysteries. There are things called sitrei Torah, hidden esoteric ideas that are contained in the Torah. And the Rambam says, you know that I cannot reveal too much. Remember, this was his introduction to the very beginning of section 3 of the guide, where he went into a discussion of Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava, as rather exclusively Ma'aseh Merkava, the act of the chariot, which is in Ezekiel chapter 1, very, very difficult to understand what that imagery is all about. And so he says, I can only reveal certain things to you. I cannot reveal everything to you. And praise the merits of those who keep them secret, although they are perfectly clear to the philosopher. In this sense, they explain the passage, her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, v'limechaseh atik, which conclude in the original with the words v'lamechaseh atik, that these blessings are promised to him who hides things which the Eternal has revealed, the mysteries of the law. And that's the Rambam quoting the Gemara in Pesachim. The Ritva says that that's not just what the Rambam was using as an introduction to his exposition on Ma'aseh Merkava, but it also applies to the Ta'amei HaMitzvot that he presents in the chapters after his interpretation of Ma'aseh Merkava. And that is that even the mitzvot that I'm giving you, I cannot reveal everything behind them. I'm only revealing those rational ideas that appeal to a philosopher who may be reading the Torah. So the Ritva is really telling us that even when the Rambam tells us in his own writing, in his own words, that the Korbanot are not an end unto themselves, the Rambam is only speaking to the philosopher. But the Rambam himself believes that there is intrinsic value to the mitzvot. Now, let's put that aside for just a minute, because even taking the Rambam at face value, if this is the argument that's going to be brought before the philosopher, it still has to make sense. What about the arguments or the questions, the challenges that the Ramban had asked the Rambam from the story of Noah? Well, the Ritva points out that even in Noah's generation, idolatry had been rampant before the flood, because Noach lived after the Dor Enosh, which according to our sages, the generation of Enosh, was steeped in idolatry. And so therefore, when Noah brought his sacrifice, the Torah says in Genesis chapter 9 that after Noah brought his sacrifice, Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoch, that God imbibed the savory fragrance of the sacrifice and was very pleased with Noah's sacrifice. That's because it accomplished the same goal as the Torah's prohibition of idolatry, namely to offer the same kind of worship but to God alone. This is why God imbibed the fragrance, meaning that he was pleased with it, since Noah's example would dissuade future generations from idolatry. Noah comes from a generation of idolaters. He knows that the mode of worship that idolaters use is animal sacrifice, and therefore he takes the very same objects that the idolaters used from the world that he came from and now transfers that to the worship of God. That's something pleasing to Hashem, because he knows that future generations will take Noah's cue and do the very same thing. So the Ritva is not bothered by the challenge of Noah, even though there were no human beings other than Noah and his family alive at that time. Now, to respond to the argument from Bilam, the Ritva says that Bilam learned about sacrificial service from the Jews and offered what he felt God would want to be appeased by. And that's why he offered animal sacrifices. It wasn't because Bilam was aware of the whole psychology of, that the Korbanot were given to the Jews in order to pull them away from idolatry. He wasn't aware of that. All he knew is that the Torah tells the Jewish people that when you want to worship God, worship with animal sacrifices. So Bilam said, let me use the very weapon that God gave the Jews to save themselves in order to harm them. So he says, I'll use animal sacrifices without being conscious of this whole backdrop of the reason behind the Korbanot. But the thing that the Ritva says that needs to be unpacked for just a couple more minutes is the story about Cain and Abel. And I'll just read to you that one line that he says, V'dvar Cain v'hevel, imalei shenit alei merabenu zal dat hamoreh b'davar Cain v'hevel, haya otzer b'kul muso milomar masha omar al harav zal. Regarding Cain and Abel, even though there was no idolatry rampant in their society, because there was no society, they were the first human beings after Adam and Eve. And even though there was no reason, therefore, for them for Hevel to bring an animal sacrifice, nonetheless, I have an answer, says the Ritva. And his answer is that had the Ramban seen what the Rambam himself writes about Cain and Abel, he never would have challenged the Rambam from the story of Cain and Abel. So that's a very cryptic statement. Had Nachmanides known what the Rambam wrote about Cain and Abel, he never would have challenged him. The annotator to my version of Sefer HaZikaron doesn't understand what the Ritva means. However, the commentaries suggest that where does the Rambam talk about the story of Cain and Abel? Go back to section 2, chapter 30. We did this chapter together. If you want to listen to it again, there's a small section in that chapter, which is a lengthy chapter, that talks about the story of Cain and Abel. And it's important to know that this is a very controversial chapter, section 2, chapter 30, because the Rambam writes that many of the details of the story of Genesis contained in the first several chapters of the book of Genesis are meant to teach allegorical lessons, meaning that sometimes the text itself is so very difficult to understand at face value, and therefore you have to understand it as teaching a philosophical lesson, including, the Rambam says, the story of Cain and Abel. And the Rambam himself was cryptic in that chapter. He just said that you know about the story about Cain and Abel, that they provide moral lessons for the philosopher. And he doesn't even explain that. But we looked at the Shem Tov commentary at the time. And the Shem Tov commentary says that Cain and Abel are personality archetypes. They are not necessarily the two human beings, Cain and Hevel, and he also talks about Shet, the third child of Adam and Eve, but they represent personality types. Cain represents the drive to acquire physical power and goods. Abel represents the drive to grow spiritually and intellectually. Seth, Shet, is the intermediate between the two, the philosopher king. Abel dies most quickly, and Cain dies after a respite. Only Seth, who was able to maintain a balance between the spiritual and the physical, can endure eternally. If you focus exclusively on the spiritual in this world, you will perish because you're not taking care of the physical framework that you need in order to live in a physical world. But if you focus exclusively on the physical at the expense of the spiritual, then you'll eventually die and you will find no immortality. Shet is the one who's able to create a balance, taking care of his body, nurturing and feeding his soul, and he's the one who finds immortality because of the perfection of his soul. Now, if Cain represents the drive for physical gain, we can perhaps understand why he brought pure quality vegetable crops, whereas Abel, who eschews the physical so readily, brought from his choicest animals. Hevel had no reason to hold on to his animals because he saw no value in physical gain and financial gain, and therefore was so ready to just completely sacrifice and give away all of his possessions for God. These two men allegorically represent two personalities, and the Torah is therefore teaching a moral lesson about the evils of the pursuit of the physical. Now, how does that answer our question? Now that we understand that Cain and Hevel may not have actually even existed in the way that the Torah portrays them, and rather we're supposed to learn from the story of Cain and Hevel about what it means to offer a sacrifice, what it means to be altruistic, what it means to be miserly, as we saw from the trait of Cain, who doesn't want to give anything to God, and what we see from Hevel, who was willing to give his most valuable assets and give them away readily to God by bringing all of his fatted animals to Hashem. If you understand that this is teaching a moral lesson, then regardless of what historically occurred or didn't occur, you understand that the Torah's lesson has nothing to do with the sacrifices being used as a means of pulling us away from idolatry. But in that particular instance, the story of Cain and Hevel is there to teach us a moral lesson about making sure that we live a life of balance between the physical and the spiritual. And so the Ritva seems to be suggesting that the Rambam will answer this by basically saying, I don't know whether Cain and Hevel existed in the way that the Torah describes them. I don't know if they actually ever brought Korbanot, but even if they did, it certainly wasn't to deflect us away from idolatry, because idolatry didn't exist in that time, but it is to provide us with the moral lesson, the way that the Shem Tov commentary explains. So this is how we're going to end the chapter. I think one of the valuable things that we saw today, in addition to the text of the rest of chapter 32, is the way that the Ritva tries to maneuver the Rambam by saying that when you encounter certain explanations in the Moreh, especially when it comes to Ta'amei HaMitzvot, it's important to know that this is not the exclusive reasons for the mitzvot, but rather the Rambam himself will acknowledge that there's something much deeper, and this will help to deflect many of his detractors' criticisms. It's a controversial position that the Ritva is taking, but we should bear it in mind as we embark on the next chapters. We will be off again next week, unfortunately, because I'll be traveling some more, but we will resume Be'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks' time, which will coincide with Shushan Purim. I hope to be able to see you then, dear friends. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. We hope to see you soon. Let's hear good news from Eretz Yisrael. May the hostages come home, and may God keep us all of our soldiers safe. And we look forward to seeing you soon.